Well, let's get some more analysis now, and we can speak to Michael Bociurkiw, who is a Global Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and also a former spokesperson for the OSCE in Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us once again here on France 24. President Putin there today framing the West as the aggressors. He also said that the West had Russia-phobic and Nazi sentiment. What's the sort of thinking behind making those allegations, do you think?
Yeah, well, nothing surprising here. I mean, this is standard Putin rhetoric. And, what he did about withdrawing from the new START nuclear arms reduction treaty. This is Mr. Putin rattling his nuclear saber, and that because that's one of the few remaining things he has left. But look, this is clearly it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. It wasn't the other way around. So for him to accuse the West for this conflict is absolutely absurd. From the Western standpoint and from what Mr. Biden says, I think what the West needs to do right now, follow up on all this rhetoric, is to give Ukraine everything it needs, attack helicopters, fighter jets, in order for at least for it to reclaim that land bridge that the Russians got to connect mainland Russia with Crimea.
I mean, it does sound, doesn't it, like, he's showing no signs of backing down. At least that was my impression from listening to Mr. Putin today. It sounds as though, as well, he envisions a pretty long, drawn-out conflict. And I'm just wondering if he's banking on the West having a change of heart, a change of political order, or simply losing interest.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's what Mr. Putin banks on. He was banking on that in 2014 when the conflict started there and all of those failed Minsk agreements, ceasefire agreements. And I think he's also hoping that support here in the United States will soften. Mr. Biden has a bit of a problem at home with some of the right-wing Republicans, but also with people, for example, in the state of Ohio, who are not very happy with him having traveled all the way to Ukraine, but not coming to Ohio, for example, for that toxic waste spill. So competing pressures on him, but his statements are pretty clear that he's going to stick with Ukraine till the end. But again, from the Ukrainian point of view, and I've talked to several Ukrainians and Ukrainian officials, that means giving everything that Ukraine needs to defend itself, especially aerial helicopter, fighter jets, and very crucially, the ability to close their skies to those very damaging Russian cruise missiles.
Just going back to some of the content of the Putin address, and we'll talk more about what Mr. Biden said in just a moment. But one of the other striking points was that, Russia isn't really as isolated as all that, and the Russian economy's done better than a lot of people would have imagined. I mean, that's a fair point, isn't it?
In some regards, but I think what surprised Mr. Putin and his circle and Mr. Xi Jinping of China is the alliance that was struck by the West, how quickly they moved to put in these sanctions. I'm not a huge fan of Western sanctions. I think for many people, including Mr. Macron, this is a way for them to pat themselves on the back and say they've done something. But I think there are gaps in sanctions. And what I mean by that, for example, Russian tourists or Russian business is still being conducted in places like Turkey, many of the Gulf states. So those gaps need to be closed. But the Russian attempts, for example, to better integrate itself with the Chinese economy, to create an alternative bank payment system, the mere debit card, have not done very well whatsoever. So I think what we're looking at is sanctions biting further on down the road, and especially with countries like Germany, Moldova, and others lessening their dependence on Russian energy.
So how do you think Mr. Putin's speech went down domestically?
Well, look, the Russian public, to a lot of our surprise, are just not buying the Western or Ukrainian argument of things. A lot of them, I think, swallow the Russian propaganda. But I think they will, I think the hope is from Western capitals is over time, they will begin to feel the pinch of these sanctions and in whatever the way they can, put pressure on their own governments. But it's quite astounding how many ordinary Russians have bought into the Russian narrative and are supportive of Mr. Putin, although must be said that if the public opinion polls in Russia are to be believed, his support for him is softening.
And just lastly, going back to President Biden and his address in Warsaw, perhaps 4 or 5 hours after that of Mr. Putin. I mean, a really different vibe. I mean, the whole production was totally different, very different messaging. I mean, did that strike you as well?
Yeah, it was kind of reminiscent of his speech in Poland last time, but the difference here was that when, for example, Mr. Biden called for pretty much the removal of Mr. Putin last time when he was in Poland, his communications team walked back that statement. Well, I didn't hear any walking back this time, and that's good to see, because I think the general public, but also Mr. Putin needs to see that Mr. Biden means what he says. So very strong language. I'm sure, actually, I do know from monitoring social media and talking to Ukrainian friends that it did go over well in Ukraine. But at the end of the day, as the Russian missiles fall, as there's no power for many hours of a day, the Ukrainians are going to be looking for an end to this. And that, again, means getting all of the military weapons they need to push the Russian forces all the way back so they don't strike again and they don't go any further beyond Ukraine's borders.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us once again here on France at 24. Michael Bociurkiw, thank you very much indeed.